The Illuminate Arts and Faith Conference in Chattanooga, Tennessee wants to help you find your tribe. Do you get way too excited about quoting Wendell Berry or C.S. Lewis in conversations with coworkers? Does your Spotify playlist include hymns, a little jazz, and a whole lot of Andrew Peterson? Join your tribe at Illuminate March 31 and April 1 for education and inspiration from speakers Russ Ramsey, Douglas McKelvey, John Hendricks, and others. Find a complete list of session topics and ticket information at southern.edu/illuminate.
In 2024, I set out to meet as many poets as I could and spend an hour with each one. I got more than I bargained for, more insight, more clarity, more hope. It's proved to be one of the richest highlights of my life. 17 writers, 17 deeply human conversations that made me sit up and pay attention. Franz Kafka once said, if the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow to the head, what are we reading for? A book must be the axe for the frozen sea within us. And that's what I hope this new book will do. I hope it wakes us up, my friends. I hope these conversations will be the catalyst for something to be reawakened, re-enchanted, and reinvigorated. It's called An Axe for the Frozen Sea, Conversations with Poets About What Matters Most. I'm Ben Palpin, and I hope you'll come and listen in as I spend a little time with poets like Lucy Shaw, Malcolm Guite, Dana Gioia, and Lee Young Lee. Pull up a chair at the table as we dig into what it means to write well and to live well. An Axe for the Frozen Sea is now available from Rabbit Room Press. Visit the store at rabbitroom.com, or better yet, ask about it at your favorite bookseller.
Welcome to the Habit Podcast, conversations with writers about writing. I'm Jonathan Rogers, your host. Laura Fabrycky is an American writer living in Brussels, Belgium. Her work has been published in Books and Culture, the Foreign Service Journal, Good Housekeeping Middle East, the Review of Faith and International Affairs, Comment, Christianity Today, Fathom, and elsewhere. She focuses on questions of political theology and cultivating the moral imagination for the common good. Laura's husband is a career diplomat, so she's lived overseas for much of her adult life. During their stint in Berlin, Germany, she became a tour guide at the Bonhoeffer house, the house where the adult Dietrich Bonhoeffer lived when he was in Berlin and where he was arrested by the Nazis. Laura's latest book, The Keys to Bonhoeffer's House, is an historically grounded memoir of her experience there. Laura Fabrycky, thank you so much for being on the Habit Podcast. I'm so glad you're here.
It's really great to be with you, Jonathan. Thanks.
You were a tour guide at the Bonhoeffer House in Berlin for a couple of years, right?
That's correct, yes.
And so your book, The Keys to Bonhoeffer's House, tell us about what you learned in that process.
Yes. Yeah, my book is, as I describe it, it's a historically grounded memoir about my experience as a volunteer guide at the Bonhoeffer House. And our family had moved to Berlin for my husband's next diplomatic assignment in the summer of 2016. And as we were settling into life there, I discovered that we lived literally within biking distance of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's adult residence. So it wasn't the home that he grew up in, but it was the home that he lived in as an adult when he would come to Berlin. And it was the home that the Gestapo arrested him from in 1943. And it's now a memorialized home, like officially recognized as a memorial site, as there are many places in Germany that are related to World War II and to the Nazi era. And so when I learned that, I scheduled a visit with our family to go. And I kept going back. I would schedule more visits, and I kind of became known there enough that some of the guides would say, "Oh, Frau Fabrycky, here you are again," and just like, "Yeah, here I am." And then I asked them kind of jokingly, like, "Could I should come so often? I should become a volunteer here." And they said, "Yeah, you should." And that was the point at which I kind of made a more diligent effort to learn Bonhoeffer's life and to learn how to narrate it to others.
Yeah. Okay. Now, so that house, you learned a lot about from being present in that house. The Bonhoeffer story went from being this abstraction to something very concrete and something that you lived in.
Yeah. I had a vague, kind of growing up in the church, I had a vague kind of ambient knowledge, from just understanding it from like references in sermons or from professors that I admired. But I had also known of him as a Christian hero. So I had sort of the Hollywood idea of who Bonhoeffer was, which is a very kind of American telling of his life, and imagines him as sort of this, a David against the Nazi Goliath. And I had never really thought of him as an actual flesh and blood person, and not simply a character in a heroic tale. And then to actually situate him in a physical home, not even a museum, but it really feels like a house, like just a regular house, kind of bust open all the categories that I had. And I really wanted to get to know him as a man. And I realized that in order to do that, I actually had to get to know the shape of his life in relationship to other people, and to stories of his life, like his family's stories, and then his relationship even to his nation. And so in some ways it helped me to kind of unpack those. Oh, sorry, I hate that word. I hate using unpack. I'm sorry. Okay, start over. Exploring his life through the lens of his house helped me to think better about the places of my life, the stories of my life, and the stories that I live in that are related to my country and my nation as an American. So not related to Bonhoeffer's German life.
Yeah. So you said a minute ago that you had kind of an Americanized vision of Bonhoeffer. Can you say more about that? What do you mean when you say an Americanized vision? Or you might not have said vision, but an Americanized version.
Version. Yeah. I mean, I think probably the biggest feature of that story has a very bright and central lens on him as the singular and central character of his own life. And if you imagine his life as a stage, the spotlight is always on him. And as I got to know him better, I realized that the spotlight kept getting wider and wider, and that more people, we needed to account for more people in the story of his life. And that I don't think he would have even put his own life as centrally as we tend to place it. He understood Christ as the center, and he also understood the church as not simply a group of atomized individuals who are the central players in their own lives, but as people who are intimately related to one another in Jesus. And we become proximate and he becomes central. And that to me was in some ways what the house represented, was this, not that Bonhoeffer wasn't there, but that he was not as central a character as I had imagined him to be. And I think that that's a very, very common American telling of his life.
You use a phrase, at least one of your endorsers quoted you as saying, people matter to places. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, that line comes in a chapter, one of the later chapters that's related to my exploration of his friendship with his friend Eberhard Bethge. And I use it to say that even for Bonhoeffer and for his friend Eberhard Bethge, who wrote the definitive biography of Bonhoeffer, their friendship belonged to the house and to particular places. And we do too. Like all of our learning, all of our engagement in the world is through our bodies. Like our bodies and our bodies matter to places. And we can't be absolutely everywhere, even though we're talking through this, digital format. Yeah. Like I'm in a place, you're in a place, and these places we can easily kind of imagine them away, but they're actually really integral and central to who we are as people and the stories that we tell, the way that we imagine ourselves. And so for me, the Bonhoeffer house was part of that. And Bonhoeffer and his friend Eberhard Bethke they belonged to one another, and they belonged to that particular house. Like Bethke would come and stay over in their travels, and they would hang out in his room. And, so that's what I meant in that line.
Well, so it's easier for me to understand the idea that places matter to people than that people matter to places.
Yes.
So tell me a little bit more about that distinction.
Yeah. I think because our family is in the U.S. Foreign Service, I tend to think a lot about how we move to new places and how those places kind of put their imprint on us, but that we also put our imprint on them. And we can't ever escape that kind of bodily exchange in some ways, like just literally breathing the air, eating food, smelling smells. And obviously that describes kind of the way that a place and cultures bear on us, but that we also bear on the places to which we belong. And that's in part what I'm hoping will come from readers engaging with my book, is that they will think about how they matter to the places that they live in, that they belong to, and that their imprint, what they actually bear on those places, their responsibilities to those places, the way that they articulate love and care for those places, deeply matters. Yeah.
One thing I kept thinking about as I was reading your descriptions of the Bonhoeffer house is something that gets said around the rabbit room often is feasting is an act of war. And this house was a place where, in spite of all, there was joy and there was friendship and good fellowship. I just finished reading The Lord of the Rings. I've never read The Lord of the Rings all the way through before.
That's great.
Yeah, I know. I'm so proud of myself. But the importance of joy and the word merry and merriment keeps coming up in that story, because evil, its first casualty, or maybe not its first casualty, but one of the first casualties is joy.
Yes.
And so that pleasure is sort of the first bait, but then it's not the mission of evil to hand out pleasures. It lures us in with pleasures, but then takes those pleasures away.
Yes.
And Bonhoeffer's house is a place where joy persisted in spite of evil.
Absolutely. And I think that's something that I think we don't get as much in Bonhoeffer per se. Like, we can read his letters, but because he was formed as a German academic, we get a lot of German academicness out of him. But apparently he actually had a pretty decent sense of humor. And I know he knew how to party. Like, he definitely knew how to have a good time. And he learned a lot of his skills in having a good time in his family, first and foremost. His mom especially was really skilled at gathering people, disarming people, creating fun events where there's often a lot of communal singing. I think that's one of the things that I found. So I think something that we've really lost is, and not that I'm trying to recapture, I'm not advocating for everyone to do communal singing, but just that they really knew what to do with themselves when they got together. They knew how to have a good time. And so I think it is easy to kind of get mesmerized by all the political conspiracy, and of course anything related to Nazi Germany just makes it just dark and dramatic. But underneath their refusal to participate in the Nazi myth was this deep, and I think rightly, defiant joy, and a joy in what makes human life good and pleasurable. Yeah,
I love it. A phrase you use, and you didn't originate it, but you use it to good effect, and that is civic housekeeping.
Yeah.
And which sounds like part of what you're describing when you talk about what was going on in the Bonhoeffer house.
Definitely. So part of the Bonhoeffer family knew how to feast, and they knew how to be together in a really pleasurable and formational way. And they also saw that as not simply something that what happened within their walls, but that actually needed to be connected to their neighbors and to fellow citizens. So ideally, all of our politics is informed by that more basic sense of joy and pleasure in forming bonds of affection and friendship and belonging and care. And I think they really saw their participation, and I think this also informed Dietrich's participation in being willing to fight for something that was good. It came from a deeper place of joy. So civic housekeeping, you're right. It's not from Bonhoeffer. I take it from Jane Addams, who was, a leader in kind of social justice in the early 20th century, the early 1900s. And she saw that, she saw civic housekeeping as something that was primarily in the language of women and women's work. But it was caring for larger spaces outside of the home. So she actually, in Chicago, she created a place called the Whole House. I'm sorry, this is a lot of Jane Addams. If you want to take some notes, you can. But I see a lot of these, Bonhoeffer never used this language, but I see him doing very similar kinds of things, a care for his nation that attended to civic spaces and caring for neighbors. And I think as Americans, it's something that we've lost. It's actually part of our story, and I want us to get it back and to see it as something that we can joyfully participate in. And I think that Bonhoeffer is a kind of a classic example of someone who is doing civic housekeeping.
Yeah, I tell you what, I know that here in the middle of this, we're recording this in the middle of the coronavirus quarantine, and so I know it gets a little tiresome talking about this all the time. However, I've noticed in my neighborhood, the fact that we can't we don't get in our cars and go do other things means suddenly, we're all out walking around, and we, from a safe distance, are talking to one another. I've met people I've never known, and now I know what their dogs' names are. And it just feels like this kind of reset and a reminder that we live our lives locally. Yes. And it's so easy to forget that and you're in Brussels, Belgium, and I'm in Nashville, Tennessee. And so in that sense, we're, what we're doing right now sort of belies what I'm saying. But the truth is that, I've been praying and hoping, none of my work requires that I be local.
Yeah.
And so I've been thinking about, having a more local life. Wasn't quite picturing this local. But it's been doing good work in my heart, really. To have such a local life and to know my neighbors and this all feels relevant to what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think it is. And you rightly say we're recording this in the midst of, and my book was released in the midst of this pandemic. And it's been interesting to see what some of the arguments that I make in it, how they matter to this moment in time. And I think they do. And I think we're being, in some ways, it's an awful moment, but we're being given the opportunity to discover things that we might not have been ever forced to look at, and I think that's exciting. It's exciting.
Yeah. I want to close the loop on all this with regard to writing, because this is supposed to be a writing podcast. I think everything you said is relevant to writing, but now is the time to sort of bring it back to that. Civic housekeeping, what does that have to do with the work of the writer?
I think in part for me, I've actually given this a lot of thought. It matters in a number of ways. It matters to what I read, and it matters to my faithfulness in actually writing. So if in my vocation as a writer, I actually have to be quite attentive to what I read. And we live in a time in which it is very easy to be mindless about our reading. Yeah. And so I know on some of your earlier conversations on this podcast, you've talked about sort of the deep work or how attenuated our levels of concentration have gotten. And so for me, it's important that I set aside time where I am doing concentrated and deep reading and literally exercising with a pen and paper, writing. And so to me, those are things that I regularly both fight and also try to incorporate in my life as a writer. And I see that as kind of writing housekeeping.
And by the way, what kind of reading are you doing that's when the reading you are making yourself or making sure that you do? Yeah, maybe I should say making yourself do, but making sure.
I tend to typically have a book that I'm reading that's more related to my spiritual life. I'm rereading Kathleen Norris's Acedia and Me right now.
Oh man, what a book.
It's such a good book. And then I'm working on entertaining another book idea that's related to life in Belgium. It's called Cities of Ladies, and it's about the Beguines, the Beguine religious movement. So more on that later. And that's like an academic book. It's like, it's a very dense study about the, late medieval Beguine religious movement.
I don't know anything about the Beguine.
Well, that's why I got to write a book about it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think the things you're talking about, when you talk about love of neighbor and cultivating. Now I'm drawing a blank on the language you're using, but it was so good in terms of that our political. You're in a foreign service family and are think a lot about the larger issues than I do, probably in terms of world events and politics. But as you say, I don't care how big the scale is. It starts with this sort of local life, loving your neighbor, and cultivating a moral imagination that is that makes sense, right? That's not market driven, for instance. And if we are, whatever our positions are on markets or on politics, hopefully they're informed by these these connections that go way deeper than economics and politics and these other things. And I think that the writer has a gift and responsibility to shape those bonds.
Yes. And a writer needs to be a particular writer that does understand themselves as related to other people and not just operating out of their own sense of self-actualization, right? I care very much about the life of the mind, about the moral imagination, and I even care about the political imagination. I studied political theory in college. I continue to be a student of political theory and political theology. I think that the metaphors and images that we use to think about politics very much shape our political lives. And I tend to think of politics, I refuse to give into politics as a contact sport. I think politics is simply how we relate to one another. It's just simply how we do community. And so that's part of what I'm also doing in this book is I am wanting to seed the ground with some different forms of fertilizer and hoping that different things will grow. And I see that in my task as a writer is to turn up ground, pull out stones, and then hopefully plant and fertilize some new ideas.
I love it. Talk to me about you spoke of political metaphors. Yes. Instead of politics as a contact sport, what's a better metaphor than, I guess that's a simile.
Yeah.
What's a better simile? I mean, you may have already said all you have to say on the subject, but what metaphors can we replace?
Yeah, I mean, I would prefer to think of politics in terms of pothole filling and solving hard problems with a group of people. And so there are a lot of, there's sausage making as the metaphor for politics, right? Like there's you don't want to see it being made, but it gets made. Yeah. There's also the classic metaphor of politics is a slow, boring through hard boards. There's those kinds of images. Mm-hmm. I tend to think of it as more on a street filling potholes. We find on a street, we are related to each other. We are all using these pathways, and we're going to hit potholes, and we need to figure out who's going to fill it, how it's going to get paid for. That's basically what politics is.
Yeah. Good. I like it.
Good.
There's a humility in the way you talk about your relationship to Bonhoeffer and Bonhoeffer's house that I think is really helpful for writers. So there are two things you say, and I think we can get to both of them. You said at one point that you were tempted to discern analogies between Dietrich Bonhoeffer's world and your own, but you learned to resist that temptation. Let's start with why. Why do you resist the temptation to discern analogies between his time and yours? That seems like a healthy thing to do when you consider an historical figure. Why do you resist the temptation to draw those analogies?
Yeah. Bonhoeffer's name gets invoked a lot, but he's often not really known for just being himself. He's often, I think, he's drawn into conversations about things like, we need a Bonhoeffer for our time. And I was interested in understanding Bonhoeffer in his time. And I was also a little suspicious of making him my avatar, like using him as the way that I would make a point. It was kind of important for me, and I'm very glad you see it as humility, but to establish myself as a character who is in a posture of learning and not as the person becoming the expert. So I am still only a student of Bonhoeffer. The Bonhoeffer Scholar Guild is crowded and smart. And I was never going to actually become a scholar of Bonhoeffer, but I was also very aware that Bonhoeffer, he kind of inhabits the public imagination, a popular imagination. Like there's all kinds of historical fiction that's been written about him, and there's things that we don't know about him. He's kind of an easy character to paint and to use. And I was concerned about kind of seeing him as sort of either an easy hero or a hero that I over-identified with. And I think we do this even with scripture, that we always want to imagine ourselves as Bonhoeffer, just like we always want to imagine ourselves as David and never as the Goliath. And we tend to think that we would be Bonhoeffer in Nazi Germany and not necessarily one of the German Christians who was joyfully imbibing Nazi propaganda. And I didn't want to take that for granted, that I would be simply able to see as clearly and courageously the truth and the lies. And so I needed to kind of make sure I let him be him and to get a clear understanding of who I was, and then to discover correspondences between our lives. And that's what I use as the metaphor and the keys. So I don't say like, Bonhoeffer did this, therefore you should do this. I try to say, well, this is what I see in him, and I think this is how it might correspond to my life and to other people's lives. And they seem kind of cute, but for me, they were the things that this is really what I took away from my time at the Bonhoeffer house. I can't neatly say, figure out who's the Nazi villain and then figure out who that is in my life. I have to figure out my life. I have to actually have to understand the characters and the stage of my life.
There's at the end of Ava DuVernay's documentary 13 or 13th, I can't remember. I don't know if you've seen that.
No, I haven't.
But somebody, and I think it is, I think it might be, well, I'm not sure who it is at the end, who says, don't ask yourself, or don't do the thought experiment of, if I were in the time period of slavery, what would I have done? Or if I were in the time period of Jim Crow, what would I have done? It says, you're already doing it. The way you're living right now is it's not like, and this was specifically with regard to race, it's not like this is all over and you can imagine what it would have been like back then.
Yeah.
you're already being who you. It's not even who would have been. That's right. That's who you are.
Yes.
Anyway, it was very convicting to me, to tell you the truth. That moment in that documentary. But next question related is, you said something along the lines of you realized that you weren't making discoveries about Bonhoeffer, that you were just you just had some keys. Tell me, what's the difference in having keys and making discoveries?
Yeah, I had to rely heavily on my German colleagues at the house, on other scholars and other writers to teach me about Bonhoeffer. And so nothing that I was saying was particularly new. I was saying it for myself. I was saying it in a way that mattered, that helped me to understand his life. And, my publisher thinks that other people might find it helpful as well. And, but in the same way that like Bonhoeffer was not a singular hero, I also was not the singular character in the story. Like I was discovering things that I needed to be restated in my life, but it's not like they were major discoveries. I think the places where I found correspondence helped me to discover things, but in general, they're kind of just pretty standard human fare. Like we gotta love each other, like just stuff that has to be resaid over and over and over because we struggle to remember.
Yeah. Did you struggle with self-doubt as you were knowing that people who knew a lot more than you about Bonhoeffer were going to read this book?
Yes, constantly. I constantly struggle with self-doubt. I still do. I have been nervous that I have done my due diligence as a student, that I really can show to those who deeply know Bonhoeffer's work that I have done him justice. Mm-hmm. And I cared about that because he's not someone that I can I can't paint him by number. He was a real human being, and there's real documents that we can refer to. And I couldn't just make stuff up, and I couldn't just say what I thought. It had to correspond to like a historical record. So yes, I struggled a lot with doubt.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm glad you pushed through and wrote this anyway, because as you said, you're not framing this as here's a definitive story of Bonhoeffer. Right?
No, it's not. And what I hope though is that that readers will find their imaginations fired for their own places. And
great.
Yeah,
I love it. Yeah, I wrote a biography, a spiritual biography of Flannery O'Connor. And every day I woke up and would kind of tick off the list of people that I knew of who knew more about her than I did. And it was hard to push through that every morning, knowing that there are a lot of people who are more qualified to do this than I am. But I was the one who was doing it. That was my job that day, to do it, not to it didn't matter. There are still people who know, way more than I do on this subject. But oh well,
Oh well, and in some ways, when you're engaging with a figure like Flannery O'Connor or with Dietrich Bonhoeffer, you're trying to befriend them, and there's going to be something that you see in your friendship with them that's unique, and no one else may be able to share that, but other people would be able to say, well, that's not really Flannery, or that might be you, or that's not really Dietrich. So you kind of have to assess that out.
I had to learn to wake up and think about the people who might need this book instead of the people who already know so much that they don't need it.
Yeah. Did you find that with Flannery O'Connor? I needed to write this book. I had to write it to help myself remember. That's that's why I wrote it. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. And, when I finished that book, and it took me forever, I don't know, 20 months, 24 months, and it's not a big book. And the day after I submitted that manuscript, I got up the next morning and wanted to read some Flannery O'Connor because I just loved her that much, And, so anyway, okay. I always end these conversations with the question, who are the writers who make you want to write?
Yeah, I'm ready. I love that question. I love discovering who people love. So Penelope Fitzgerald, Oliver O'Donovan. You don't know Penelope Fitzgerald?
Wait, no. Okay, start over. Penelope Fitzgerald?
Yeah, Blue Flower. Do you know Penelope Fitzgerald?
No.
You must. She's incredible. She also, what I adore about her too, is that she did some of her meatiest and most award-winning writing in her like 70s and 80s.
Really?
Yeah. Like she's a perfect ripening figure. Oliver O'Donovan in political theology.
Okay.
Kathleen Norris, who I've already mentioned. Mm-hmm. And then in poetry, Denise Levertov, Kay Ryan. I love Kathleen Patterson. She went like Bridge to Terabithia. Like she's a genius.
Yeah.
Particularly I actually really like her nonfiction, her Spying Heart book. And she has another book that I actually am completely blanking on the title, but she called it her kitchen sink memoirs. It's like the stories that she would tell her family members as they wash dishes at the kitchen sink. I love her nonfiction. Yeah. That's it. I'll leave it.
Well, great. Well, I'm glad you told me about Penelope Fitzgerald. I did not know about her.
Blue Flower. She also wrote The Bookshop. She's an incredible writer.
Is she American?
She's British.
Okay.
She's also deceased.
Yeah.
And
Okay. Yeah. All right. Laura Fabrycky, thank you so much. This was great. And I know this wasn't a great time to release a book, but I hope a lot of people read it and are blessed by it.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. I appreciate it.
The Rabbit Room has partnered with Lipscomb University to make this podcast possible. Lipscomb has graciously given us access to their recording studio in the Center for Entertainment and Arts building. We're so grateful for their sponsorship, their encouragement, and the good work they do in Nashville. Special shout out as well to Jess Ray for letting us use her song Too Good as part of this podcast. Visit jessraymusic.com to hear more of her beautiful songs.
Habit Membership is a library of resources for writers by me, Jonathan Rogers. More importantly, The Habit is a hub of community where like-minded writers gather to discuss their work and give each other a little more courage. Find out more at thehabit.co.
This podcast was produced by The Rabbit Room, where art nourishes community and community nourishes art. All our podcasts are made possible by the generous support of our members. To learn more about us, visit rabbitroom.com, and to become a member, rabbitroom.com/donate.
If you've enjoyed this podcast episode, consider joining the Rabbit Room membership. Your membership helps sustain this community, funding everything from publishing and podcasts and theater productions to events and programs that support artists who create with a Christ-centered vision. We'd love to have you on board. Learn more at rabbitroom.com/member.